Elizabeth Wright stood at the window of her small apartment. 30 years old was the age when everything should be clear in life, but now she felt more lost than ever. "Late again, Elizabeth?" came the sharp voice of Margaret Stone, the owner of the appliance repair shop, as she crossed the threshold. "Sorry, Mrs. Stone. The bus is stuck in traffic because of the rain," Elizabeth replied quietly, taking off her wet jacket. "You always have excuses," Margaret snorted, adjusting her gold-rimmed glasses. "I wish you worked as hard as you do to make up excuses for being late." Elizabeth walked silently to her desk. In the 5 years she had been working in this workshop, she had become accustomed to Margaret's constant nagging. At least this job allowed her to pay off the debts that had been left behind when Michael left, taking all her savings with him. "Hi, Liz," came the friendly voice of Robert, her only friend at work. "Don't take it personally. You know the old witch." "Robert," Elizabeth hissed, looking around. She might hear. The man just shrugged and went back to fixing the old iPad. Elizabeth sighed and set to work, her fingers skillfully disassembling the broken smartphone, her mind wandering far away. She remembered the last conversation she had with her father, which took place almost a year ago. After her mother's death from cancer, their relationship had turned to cold politeness. Her father blamed her for not quitting her job to care for her mother in her last months. But how could she? With Michael's debts hanging over her, she couldn't afford to lose her job. "Elizabeth!" Margaret's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "You have a customer." An elderly woman with an expensive Gucci handbag stood at the counter. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" Elizabeth smiled professionally. "My phone. It just stopped working," the woman explained, pulling out a brand new iPhone. "I would like to pick it up today. I have an important meeting in the evening." "Unfortunately, that's not possible," interjected Margaret, who appeared out of nowhere. "We have a lot of orders and the minimum lead time is 3 days. "But," Elizabeth began. "No buts," Margaret cut her off. "Either 3 days or find another studio." The elderly woman looked at them indignantly and, taking her phone, left the store. "You could have fixed it in an hour," Elizabeth said quietly. "Don't tell me how to run a business," Margaret snapped. "If you don't like something, the door is right there." Elizabeth went back to her desk, feeling her insides boiling with injustice. The evening was particularly difficult. There were few clients, and Margaret seemed to find special pleasure in criticizing her every move. On her way home late in the evening, Elizabeth stopped at a small shop to buy something for dinner. Her wallet was almost empty. She still had 10 days to go until her paycheck. In her one-room apartment, she mechanically reheated yesterday's soup and sat down in front of the TV. On the screen, a beautiful couple was talking about their happy life in an insurance company commercial. The city had already plunged into darkness, with only street lamps creating yellow circles of light on the wet asphalt. She remembered her ex, Michael. Who would have thought that 10 years later he would turn out to be a fraud who would take advantage of her trust and leave her with huge debts? The phone vibrated, a message from her father. "It's Mom's birthday. I hope you at least visited her grave." Elizabeth felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had forgotten. How could she have forgotten? Putting the phone down, she walked over to a small dresser and pulled out an old photo of her mother. She was smiling, holding little Elizabeth's hand in the park. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered, touching the photo. "I'm just as bad as before." As she went to bed, Elizabeth thought about how her life had gone wrong. It seemed that every choice she made, every decision she made, led her further and further away from the happiness she had dreamed of in her youth. And the worst part was that she saw no way out of this vicious circle of failure and disappointment. The rain had finally stopped, but the cold wind was chilling to the bone. Elizabeth hurried to work, trying not to be late. Suddenly, an old man sitting on a park bench caught her attention. "Come on, get to work," he muttered, trying to open the back of his old phone with trembling hands. Elizabeth wanted to walk by, but something made her stop. Perhaps it was his look, so lost and lonely. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Is there something wrong with your phone?" The man flinched in surprise. His clothes were shabby but clean, and his eyes were intelligent. "It just stopped working," the old man answered, his voice trembling. "You see, this is the only way my son's number is available." Elizabeth looked at the phone. It was an old Nokia, a model she hadn't seen in years. "My name is Sylvester," he suddenly said. "Sylvester Clark. I used to be an engineer, can you imagine?" He smiled bitterly. "And now I can't even fix a phone." "I work in an appliance repair shop," Elizabeth said. "I can see what's wrong with it." Sylvester clutched the phone tighter. "I don't have the money to pay for the repair. I can look at it for free." The words came out before she could think. "Why?" he asked incredulously. "Why do you want to help?" Elizabeth didn't know the answer herself, perhaps because in his eyes she saw the same pain she felt herself. "Tell me about your son," she asked, carefully picking up the phone. Sylvester remained silent for a long time, looking off into the distance. "His name is Thomas. He was such a smart boy. He always dreamed of big business. After his mother died, I failed. I started drinking. I lost my job, my house. Thomas tried to help me, but I pushed him away." Elizabeth carefully opened the phone case. 15 years ago," Sylvester whispered. "This number is all I have left." She saw the problem: oxidized contacts and a damaged circuit board. "It won't be easy, but it can be done." "Give me a few hours," she said, standing up. "I work in that workshop across the street. Come by in the evening." "I can't accept," Sylvester began. "Yes, you can," Elizabeth said firmly. "We all need help sometimes." In the workshop, Margaret immediately noticed an outside phone. "What is this? Personal business during working hours?" "I'll work through it," Elizabeth replied calmly. "I'll stay after work." "You're dragging all this junk into the studio again?" Margaret snapped. "Do what you want, but if any customer complains..." Elizabeth worked on Sylvester's phone all day between other orders. It was not easy to find parts for such an old model, but she was lucky. The box of old spare parts had everything she needed. "You seem strange today," Robert said during the lunch break. "Did something happen?" Elizabeth shook her head. "It's just that sometimes life gives us a chance to do something right, you know?" Robert shrugged his shoulders. "You've always been too good for this place." As the sun began to set, the workshop door opened. Sylvester stood on the threshold, fidgeting nervously with his fingers. "Come in," Elizabeth called. "I've just finished." She handed him the phone. "Try turning it on." Sylvester pressed the button with trembling hands. The screen lit up, and an incredulous smile appeared on his face. "It works," he whispered. "Oh my God, it really works." "I replaced the battery and restored the contacts," Elizabeth explained. "It should last a long time now." Sylvester looked at the phone as if it were his greatest treasure. "I don't know how to thank you. Just promise me one thing," Elizabeth said. "If the number still works, call him. Sometimes life gives us a second chance." When the old man left, Elizabeth stood by the window of the workshop for a long time. She thought about her father, about the calls she hadn't made and the words she hadn't said. Perhaps it was time for her to take advantage of her second chance. The morning began as usual. Elizabeth woke up to the sound of her alarm, mechanically made coffee, and began to get ready for work. Yesterday's meeting with Sylvester seemed like a distant dream. "Oh my God!" she exclaimed, noticing a coffee stain on her only clean white blouse. This was not her day. Elizabeth quickly changed into a simple sweater and left the house. The autumn air was crisp, and she picked up her pace to keep warm. As she turned the corner to the workshop, she stopped abruptly. A long black limousine stood at the entrance, looking completely out of place on this old street with cracked asphalt. "Miss Wright?" asked a tall man in a black suit standing by the car. Elizabeth instinctively took a step back. Yes, that's me. My name is William, the man bowed slightly. My employer would like to meet you. Your employer? Elizabeth felt her heart begin to beat faster. I'm afraid I can't disclose that information right now, William replied. But I assure you, this is a very important meeting. A group of school children passed by, looking at the limousine with interest. Elizabeth noticed Margaret's face appear in the workshop window. I don't even know this person, Elizabeth said. Why do I have to go somewhere I don't know? William took out an envelope and handed it to her. Perhaps this will help you make a decision. The envelope contained a photograph. It was of Sylvester holding the very phone she had repaired yesterday. Where did you get this? She whispered. Miss Wright, William said gently. Sometimes the simplest acts have the greatest impact. My employer just wants to thank you personally. Elizabeth looked at her watch. There were 15 minutes left in the day. I can't, she said. I have work to do. Oh, don't worry about that, William smiled. We've already contacted your superiors. Miss Stone gave her permission. At that moment, the workshop door opened and Margaret appeared on the threshold. Elizabeth, why are you still standing there? Don't keep important people waiting. Her voice was as sweet as honey, a tone Elizabeth had never heard before. She looked at the limo, then at the photo in her hands. Okay, I will go. William opened the car door. The interior was upholstered in soft, cream-colored leather. Elizabeth sat down carefully, feeling completely out of place in her simple sweater. Where are we going? She asked as the car moved off. To the suburbs, William answered, sitting in the opposite seat. It will take about 40 minutes. Elizabeth stared out the window, watching the familiar streets give way to more respectable neighborhoods. Her thoughts revolved around her meeting with Sylvester yesterday. I'm sorry, she finally said, but I still don't understand. All this, she gestured around the limousine's interior, because of an old phone? William looked at her with a slight smile. Miss Wright, sometimes the most important moments of our lives begin with the simplest decisions. You could have walked right past that man, as most people would have done. But you stopped. How do you know Sylvester? She asked. You will soon understand, William replied. The limousine pulled into a wide alley lined with old trees. A huge Georgian-style house appeared in the distance. Elizabeth felt her hands begin to tremble. What was she doing here? It all seemed like some kind of crazy dream. We're here, William announced as the car pulled up in front of the front steps. Elizabeth stepped out of the limo, trying to control the trembling in her knees. She had never seen such a luxurious house up close. Please follow me, William said. The massive doors opened and Elizabeth found herself in a spacious hall. Miss Wright, a deep male voice said. She turned and saw a young man. He was dressed in an expensive suit, but his face looked tired as if he had been up all night. My name is Thomas Clark, he said, extending his hand. Thank you for agreeing to come here. I'm Sylvester's son. He ran his hand through his hair in a gesture that somehow reminded her of the old man. Please come to the study. The office was a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows. Black and white photographs of cityscapes hung on the walls. Are these your works? Elizabeth asked, looking at the pictures. Yes, it's a hobby of mine, Thomas answered. Photography helps to distract me. He gestured for her to sit down in a leather chair. Miss Wright, I am. Elizabeth, she interrupted him gently. Just Elizabeth. Elizabeth, he sat down across from her. Last night I received a call from my father, for the first time in 15 years. His voice was trembling. I thought he was dead. All these years I was sure he died somewhere on the street, alone and forgotten. He told me about you, Elizabeth said quietly. How proud he was of you. Thomas smiled bitterly. Proud, after I had abandoned him. You know, I was young and angry. When my mom died and he started drinking, I couldn't stand it. I thought I was doing the right thing when I stopped answering his calls. He came to the window. For 15 years, I've been building my business, creating this empire. People call me successful, an entrepreneurial genius. And do you know what I did every weekend? I went to homeless shelters looking for him. It's not your fault, Elizabeth said. Sometimes we all make mistakes. Yesterday he called, Thomas continued. I didn't recognize his voice at first. He said, Tommy, it's Dad. You know, he always called me Tommy. Elizabeth noticed his shoulders tense. He told me about you, about how you fixed his phone. For free. Why? She wondered. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe because I saw something familiar in his eyes. The same pain I feel myself. Thomas turned to her. You didn't just save a phone, Elizabeth. You saved my family. Where is he now? She asked. In the hospital, Thomas answered. The doctors say that with the right treatment he will make a full recovery. They found him to be in the early stages of pneumonia. He went to his desk and took out an envelope. I want to thank you and offer you a job in my company. Elizabeth looked at him in surprise. But you don't even know me. I know enough, he replied. I know that you are an honest and kind person, that you are ready to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. My company needs such people. He handed her an envelope. Think about it. Here are all the details of the offer. Elizabeth took the envelope, feeling her hands shaking. I need time. Of course, Thomas nodded. Take as much time as you need, and thank you for everything. As she was walking toward the door, he added, Father would like to see you, if you don't mind. Elizabeth stopped. I will come. I will definitely come. As she left the house, she took a deep breath of fresh air. The envelope in her hand seemed incredibly heavy. Could she have thought yesterday that a simple act of kindness would make such a difference? The limousine was waiting to take her back, but this was a different Elizabeth, the one who was beginning to believe that sometimes life gives us a second chance, not only for Sylvester and Thomas, but also for herself. Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror in her apartment looking at her new business suit. The envelope with the offer from Thomas was on the table. She had read it dozens of times. Are you sure you want to do this? She asked her reflection. At that moment, the phone rang. It was Margaret. Elizabeth, where are you? It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm quitting, Elizabeth replied, feeling her voice tremble. There was silence on the other end of the line. What? Margaret finally exploded. You can't just... I can, Elizabeth said firmly, and I've already made my decision. She hung up without waiting for an answer. It was the first time in 5 years that she had dared to interrupt Margaret. An hour later, Elizabeth entered the hospital room. Sylvester was sitting by the window, looking much better than he had that day on the bench. Elizabeth, he said, a smile lighting up his face. I'm so glad to see you. How are you feeling? She asked, sitting down next to him. Much better, he replied. The doctors say I'll be able to leave soon. Thomas, he found me an apartment not far from his house. Elizabeth noticed the same old phone on the nightstand. Do you still have it? Of course, Sylvester picked it up. It's not just a phone, it's a symbol of hope. You know, the day you fixed it. I prayed before I dialed Thomas's number. I was sure he had changed it long ago. But he answered. Right away. At that moment, Thomas came into the room. Oh, you're here, he smiled at Elizabeth. Have you decided on the proposal? Elizabeth took a deep breath. Yes, I accept it. Great, Thomas exclaimed. Then I'll see you in the office tomorrow at 9 o'clock. The next morning, Elizabeth stood in front of a huge glass building in the business center of the city. Her heart was beating frantically. Good morning, Miss Wright. William greeted her in the lobby. Mr. Clark is waiting for you. Thomas's office was on the top floor. When she entered, he was on the phone. Yes, I understand. I'm sorry, I have to go. He hung up and turned to her. To be honest, I'm a little scared, Elizabeth admitted. That's normal, Thomas smiled. You know, when I started my business, I was afraid too, but fear is good. It means we are alive. The next few weeks flew by like a day. Elizabeth learned a new job, met her colleagues, and discovered a new world. In the evenings, she often visited Sylvester, who now lived in a cozy apartment nearby. One evening, when they were sitting in a cafe after work, Thomas suddenly said, "You know, Elizabeth, I think it was no accident." "What is it?" she asked. "Our meeting. The fact that you helped your father. All of it." Elizabeth looked at him. "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe in people," he answered, "in their ability to change the lives of others by their actions." He took her hand. "Elizabeth, I feel something special for you." She felt her heart sink. "Thomas, I am." "Don't answer now," he said gently. "Just know that you are special, and that you deserve to be happy." And when one evening Thomas asked her to go out officially, she just smiled and said yes. Because sometimes the best stories start with a broken phone and a simple desire to help.